Up next, we have a speaker, a very popular speaker who we've had with us before and we're always excited to have back. Dr. Anthony Scriffignano is the Senior Vice President and Chief Data Scientist at Dun Bradstreet. He has more than 35 years' experience in information technologies, Big Four management consulting, and international business. He leverages his deep data expertise and global network to position Dun Bradstreet with strategic customers, partners, governments, and the data science community. He's a thought leader in D&B's worldwide efforts to discover, curate, and synthesize business information in multiple languages, geographies, and contexts. He also regularly confers with key customers on emerging trends in global data science and works with governments around the world. Today, he will be sharing how to drive meaningful outcomes in a world awash in data. So please help me welcome Dr. Anthony Scriffignano to the stage.
And I think he needs a shorter bio. So I thought that presentation was phenomenal. I thought it was really phenomenal. And I'm going to tell you why. First of all, because I can't get it off the screen. Hold on. Excellent. So, wow, I didn't know that was in there. So the reason I thought that was excellent was data, right? Please raise your hand if you have more than one mobile phone. Please raise your hand if you have more than one email address. Please raise your hand if all of your email is fully read. Oh, there's one in every crowd. We need to talk. We're surrounded by data. We're born with a neural network between our ears, right? We're born with this innate capability to process information and synthesize information and discriminate whether or not it's relevant. And we kind of, we get blasé about it. When I was growing up, Dick Tracy had a wrist radio and he could talk to people, and I thought it was the coolest thing, and now I have 2 cell phones, right? Batman had this bat computer, and he could do things like looking at, where the Joker was based on all the information they had. I never understood why the bat computer always output a riddle that Batman had to figure out in order to, why couldn't the bat computer just tell him what it knew? But, we're sort of numb. And we use the word data probably more than we use the word the lately. And everybody in this room has some connection to it because you came to this thing, right? And your connection to it is different. So we all have this different collective experience for how we got here. But if we all told the truth, we're drowning in data. The problem isn't, gee, can I have some more data? It's how do I make sense out of it? How do I draw inference from it? Is it valid to do something regressive when I know the future is not going to look like the past? Do I even have the right amount of information to make a decision? Those are really big questions. And what I loved about that presentation was it was talking about problem formulation. It was talking about where the data sits. It was talking about how you know when you have the right data. Those are the right questions. The right questions aren't like, where can I go get more data? Yeah, of course, sometimes you need more data. Actually, many times you need more data. But that's only a very small part of the problem. The MH370 flight that went missing, I think right now there are 7 arcs where that plane is placed based on the collective data that exists, which kind of means 6/7 of the data is wrong. 14% of that data is right, assuming one of those arcs is right. I don't know what to do with that. The collective minds of the human race, really, really smart people, highly motivated to solve a problem like that, drowning in data, literally drowning in data, and somebody comes along and says, here, I have some more data for you. Please leave, right? Unless you have data that you think is going to help me do something different. So what I'm going to try and talk about today in a relatively short period of time is 3 frames of thinking about this that I hope will inspire you to think about it a little bit differently. I'm going to start by being a scientist. The first thing a scientist does is they observe the world around them, right? So I'm going to observe the world around me. This is what data looked like when I was growing up. Get Smart, loved Get Smart, right? I figured it would be appropriate for a bunch of government people to talk about Get Smart, right? This is the chief and secret agent 86, and they're talking at control headquarters. Many people in the room are looking at me like, what are you talking about? Because you weren't alive when this was on, but it was really funny. And when they had to talk about something super secret, they would lower the cone of silence, right? Remember, raise your hand if you remember the cone of silence, right? Ah, excellent. The cone of silence was when they had to talk about something really secret. They would lower this, and it would block out all sound, so no one could possibly hear them. The problem is they couldn't hear each other either, right? And so they'd be going, and they'd scream and write notes. It was very funny. Check it out on YouTube. But actually, this is what happens in organizations all the time. We create the cone of silence, right? You have the information I need because you read all your email. I don't have the information because I'm getting email right now while I'm talking, and we can't talk to each other for whatever reason, a million reasons. We work for different companies, we're in different agencies, we're in different parts of the organization, and on and on and on. So do we even know when this is happening in organizations? And the answer is actually not really, not all the time. Roll the clock forward a little bit later, and this is probably what it would have looked like on a subway, when I was in undergraduate, in college. And you got a bunch of people reading about events that happened in the past and listening to people who are not present. They got their Walkman on, they're, kind of listening to something, or they're reading a newspaper. And the newspaper was published this morning, and it typically talks about things that happened yesterday. That same thing today looks like this. Now, initially, we might say, well, that's the same thing, right, except it's in color. But actually, there's a pointer on here somewhere, right? No, that's all right. If you look at the guy on the right who's texting, and you look at the person in the middle who's texting, they could be talking about the person on the left, right? They could be arguing with each other. The person on the left could be in a Skype conference with somebody on the other side of the world, in the subway, completely realistic, right? They could be reading about things that are happening in the present or actually creating the things that are happening in the present. You don't know if somebody there is live blogging, right? Has anybody here tweeted with the hashtag that we got at the beginning of well, you should be, right? No, you shouldn't be. No, you should be, right? But, that kind of stuff is just normal. I say these pithy things all the time, and then I sit back down, and I'm like, well, I'm glad nobody wrote that down, and then I find it on Twitter, right? So you have to be really careful, because right now we don't really understand what data is informing what other data, and how do you know if you saw something 3 times that you're not just seeing an echo of the same one thing? Imagine if you read 40 people were killed in an earthquake, 40 people were killed in an earthquake, 400 people were killed in an earthquake, 40 people were killed in an earthquake. Math says, add them all up and take the average. Common sense says, we don't say 400 until we know it. And the 40 is probably old news, and they just didn't get the message, right? So yeah, we do have to think about what's going on. We can't just use the numbers. We can't just consume the data and call it a day, right? Excellent. Can someone who knows something about this make my thing work here? There's a quote of the day. Thank you. So, we have on the bottom here, if you think about it, on all the way over on the left, what we had was we had a search for data. In the middle, we kind of got into this search for meaning. And now we're in this place where information is sort of drowning us. On the left, we had a need to know. In the middle, we needed to know context more, right? Because on the left, there was probably only one version of the truth. Right, if I could get a willing participant here, what's the capital of France? Paris. What's the capital of France? What's the capital of France? What's the capital of France? That's data at rest, right? How do you feel? How do you feel? How do you feel? Sooner or later, you're going to say annoyed, right? That's data in motion, right? So we've got this concept of data at rest. Thank you. We've got this concept of data at rest and data in motion, and what are we going to do about it? All right, so the questions that come to us in our world at Dun Bradstreet, it's a very large information repository. It's updated millions of times a day from hundreds of countries through 6 global data supply chains. And our customers come to us with questions. In your arena, they come to us with questions about due diligence, about oversight, about understanding master data management, reducing risk. We have lines of business that we go to market with. We help to understand immigration, border security, program integrity, public health. These are some of the things that we do to bring what we do to what you need. How cool is that? Well, I don't know. I'll let you know, right? Your answer would be, well, show me, right? Your answer wouldn't be, well, that's great. You have a slide, and it looks good. Your answer would be, well, we need to talk. First, I need to know whether or not what you have is additive to what I know. Second of all, I need to know whether you know what you think you know. Third of all, I need to figure out whether or not I can use it. And by the time I'm doing all that, the world changed. Does that feel familiar? So that's probably closer to reality. And this brings us to totally new questions and challenges. This guy, Mark Twain, I love Mark Twain, said something brilliant. He said a lot of things that were brilliant. But most of what he said, you have to stop and think about it for a minute. He said, truth is stranger than fiction because fiction has to obey the rules and truth doesn't. right? Like, when I think about that, how true is that, right? I couldn't possibly be on a phone call in live with a bunch of people in China last night and here this morning and fully participate. Well, actually, that's exactly what happened in my life, right? So, you know, we live in this world where the things that actually happen we never would have predicted. We don't have words for them. So there's this concept of computable data. That's the data that can be brought to bear on a problem with a computer. Now, if we think about everybody in this room, if everybody in this room laughed a minute ago, you did, right? Suppose I had a recording of everybody laughing in this room. Many people would call that unstructured data. I submit to you that there's really no such thing as truly unstructured data. You know where you got it. You know when you got it. You know something about it. In this case, it's an MP3 file. Right? Let's see if I can do anything with that recording of everybody laughing. Well, the first thing I can say is, gee, I studied physics. I know that the human ear can hear something somewhere in the range of 20 to 20,000 hertz. Most of us, if you're older, not quite that high, but somewhere in that range, right? So could I take that signal and could I break it apart and find only the part of that signal that was in 20 to 20,000 hertz? So the high range, you know, the clicking of the camera and the whatever, the whining of the data, all that gets filtered out. Yeah, I could do that. Could I then say, well, male voices and female voices have different average nominal ranges? And could I try to bifurcate that sound and estimate the ratio of male to female voices in the room? Yeah, actually I could. If I had enough of a sample of people talking, and I could kind of phonetically zoom in on it, I can do this when I walk through the room. I speak a lot of languages. I can tell you not only if you have an accent, but if that accent is likely to be Eastern European or Western European, if it's an Asian accent, whether it's more likely to be Chinese or Japanese. It's a party trick, but it's based on the phonetic palette of different languages. Well, if we can teach a person to do that, can we teach an algorithm to do that? You betcha. And we have algorithms that do that. So this gets curiouser and curiouser as we start to peel back this data. Unstructured data is very often a lazy way of saying, I don't know what it means yet. So that gives rise to questions we could never have thought of asking. You know, in our world, fintech is a big deal right now, using new technologies to understand behaviors. But you could substitute cyber anything here, cyber crime, cyber security, all that stuff. Those are examples of new questions we never thought about asking. Nobody ever thought about people using a Barbie doll to eavesdrop on people until they introduced talking Barbie and forgot to pay attention to the Barbie cloud, right? So these things happen, and hopefully we make new mistakes as we go along. So I'm going to leave you with these three big things to think about. The first one is called the Red Queen problem, and it has to do with turning the crank, with working, God bless you, working harder on something. I have to tell you, I was in China recently, and someone sneezed while I was talking. I said, God bless you, and in China they don't really say anything when you sneeze, so the guy looked at me and said, God bless you too, right? You just never know, right? So the Red Queen problem is about basically drowning in information. And then I'm going to talk about the dark room problem, which is the other side of it. Let's put it all in one place and lock it down. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about is the dispositive threshold, which is a gift from me. You're not going to find that one in a book. So the first one, the Red Queen problem, comes to us from the story of Alice in Wonderland, and it goes by different names. And many of you probably know that the person who wrote this book was a mathematician and a priest, and basically what we would call a polymath. He was an expert in many different subjects. And when you read the book as an adult, you find that it's a lot about logic and science and stuff, but it's couched in the frame of a children's story. And in the scene with the Mad Hatter and the Tea Party, Alice says to the Red Queen, hence the name of the problem, "This is the strangest place. I've been running and running and running ever since I got here, and I don't seem to be getting anywhere." And the Red Queen says, that's exactly the kind of place this is. You have to run as fast as you can just to stay where you are. So a Red Queen problem is a problem where just turning the crank faster, putting more resources on it, getting a bigger boat, but getting a faster computer, it won't necessarily guarantee that you'll make any progress towards solving the problem. The solution to a Red Queen problem is to do something orthogonal, completely different. Everybody who's ever watched a campy movie with quicksand in it knows you don't just struggle harder, right? You got to do something different. Well, we're living in a Red Queen problem. Many of the problems that we're trying to solve, we're trying to chase them by collecting more data, by putting more resources on them, by telling people to work harder on it, by reminding people of all of these wonderful leadership paradigms like you need to lead harder. What does that even mean, right? We need to think about these problems differently. The presentation before me was an extraordinary example of challenging, do I really need to go out and collect more data? Maybe all I need to do is ask a few experts. Now, I'm not saying that's always the answer. What I'm saying is you need to think about when you're in a red queen problem and whether you're just trying to solve it by turning the crank faster. So mobile, social, cloud, analytics, these are all the disruptive forces that are in our life. And when we talk about disruptive technologies, these are things that make us change our behavior, right? There's a laser pointer on here, allegedly, right? You know, a laser pointer is not disruptive. It doesn't force me to change my behavior. It's just a long stick, right? I could walk over there and point. I don't need to change my behavior. Cloud computing makes me think about privacy laws and data sovereignty. Does anybody think there's hard drives floating around in the sky? Of course not. Cloud computing exists physically in a place. And if you live in a world like I do, where there are laws that say you can't transport certain data across borders, or certain information can't be moved in bulk, you better have that conversation with your cloud computing compatriots before you wind up having it with the authorities, right? So same thing with mobile, right? The new disruptive thing in mobile, the whole idea of mobile was let's cut the cord. Let's take our application and move it away from the Ethernet cable. How cool is that? Well, pretty cool until you have the Barbie problem, right? So the problem now in each of these disruptive forces is that there's a sort of a close cousin. So mobile computing now has the Internet of Things. We're having enough trouble with the Internet of Internets, and now our things are talking to each other, right? I've got this little thing, and it's collecting data, and I don't know when it talks to my phone. My phone seems to know about it. Near-field communication, I get it. But the whole point is, are we really thinking about the implications of these things? I can tell you story after story of people who forgot to think about these things and rut-rows that happened. People sitting in the parking lot and reverse engineering manufacturing processes. And I've got just on the other side a cadre of people who are the zealots of the Internet of Things that say, don't worry, it's all structured, we've got it all figured out, you're a dinosaur. No, it's somewhere in between. The truth is always somewhere in between. There's no blacks and whites in this. So the point of thinking about this is it's not a binary kind of problem. It's a kind of problem where you have to think much more seriously and think differently. And if you're just trying to turn the crank in any one of these dimensions, you're probably, at best, going to stay where you are, and more than likely going to slide backwards. So the second problem, or the second paradigm, is this thing called the dark room problem. Here's the idea of a dark room problem. It's pretty cool. If you took all of the experts in a given subject and all of the information that is known about that subject and put it all in one room and lock the door, that would be the best possible place to go for insight on that subject. Absolutely. The problem is that over time, the problem space evolves, the subject matures, and the people and the experts in the room can only learn about it through the imperfect perceptions of the people outside the room and only through the closed, locked door. So over time, that room becomes the worst possible place to go for information on that. So this is data sovereignty, right? There's lots of places around the world where we want to lock the door and say the data can't cross borders. I joke with my friends in Germany that if I call them on the mobile phone, I can't say their name because I'm digitally transporting their name across borders, and that's illegal in Germany. Now, I say that as a joke, but it's actually technically true. Obviously, they're not down to that level of enforcement with that law, but we need to, I'm not saying that law is wrong. I'm not judging these laws. All I'm saying is that the lawmakers who are writing these laws probably should talk to the people who are the economists and the people who are using big data to do all kinds of crazy things, because you think you're going to lock down one type of data and someone will probably just use a different type of data, and probably in a negligent way, absent the data they want to use. So the solution to a dark room problem is to just open the window. You can keep the door locked, but open the window and kind of control what goes through the window. And you get the metaphor, right? So you understand the flows of information. You make permissible uses of data. You understand how that data is being used. You watch it being used, and you can get around a problem like that. The last one is this thing called a dispositive threshold. The idea behind a dispositive threshold is we all sort of struggle with, and it was a great example of it in the last presentation, the data we have versus the data we could go get. And there's always going to be this challenge of when do I go get more data and when do I use the data I have? And there's always going to be the people that come to you and say, can you use this data to prove blah? And your answer should always be, I don't know. I know I can use this data to study blah, but this might not even be the right data. And then they say, yeah, data dork, get out, just go answer the question, right? And sooner or later, somebody's pounding the table saying, are you done yet? Do you have the answer yet? And the dispositive threshold is when you have enough data to make a decision. But the little footnote is it's not necessarily when you have enough data to make a good decision. And there's a big difference. So it's extremely important as data scientists that we measure the sensitivity of our answer to the information we know we don't have. I used to have a great cartoon here. It was a car driving off a cliff, and the GPS was saying recalculating, right? That's not a data problem. That's a gravity problem, right? So we do need to think about these things. And then there's always going to be the data that you're never going to get. And in this room, I'm sure there's a whole lot of that, right? So just because I'm never going to get it doesn't mean that I can't do something to estimate the impact of what it would be to my answer if I had it. And then once you understand those degrees of freedom, you can make a more informed, more intelligent decision, but only if you stop and do this. If you hurry up and use the data you have because it'll make that person stop beating you, then you have ignored the dispositive threshold. So 3 big ideas: red queen, dark room, dispositive threshold. I'm going to leave you with this little chart. I assume you'll have access to it somehow. I did a lot of thinking about the V's in big data: volume, velocity, veracity, variety, value. It's, if you want to just talk about big data, you can just say all this stuff and you sound really smart. But I'm trying to demonstrate sort of the behavior of taking it one level deeper and not just saying blah, 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 lots of data, right? So there's an inconvenient truth for each of these V's. And there's a risk of ignoring that inconvenient truth. And there's some new skills that you need to have either in your organization or be hiring in order to kind of get around those risks and deal with that inconvenient truth. So for example, we talked about volume, that having more data isn't necessarily a better thing. So the risk is that curation of the data, the sort of collection of the data, takes data in motion and makes the data at rest while we're analyzing it. Well, that's a very bad thing to do in general. Another one, the data under velocity. Data I collected yesterday isn't 1 day old. It's data I collected yesterday. We often treat it like it's 1 day old because I just got it. That's a big deal. I'll just go to one last one here. Value deteriorates at an alarming rate. It's amazing how fast data decays in this world. And yet we often behave like, well, we got the data. We're good to go. So what's next? What's next in this field is we have to start to ask questions like you saw in the previous presentation. What do we have to believe? Problem formulation is huge. What are the going in assumptions? What's the bias? How have we defined done? Not all data is useful. So we got to make this balance between the data we have and the data we could go get. We've got to understand bias. And finally, this science of data science isn't just about waving our hands and saying data science. If we're going to use a regressive method, we've got to believe that the analytical frame of the past predicts the analytical frame of the future. That's a very big assumption. You better be able to defend it and not just do a bunch of math. We've got to be able to understand how we reduce complexity. Sometimes innovation is just taking a very big problem and breaking it down into a smaller problem that we haven't solved yet. That's a very good idea. There's some checklist here. Problem formulation and analytics, really important to understand the data that's available versus the other data, to consider the velocity of change, to think about non-regressive methods like artificial intelligence and unsupervised learning, and some new techniques like quantum algorithms. So there's some ideas here, there's some cognates here. If you sort of put this on the wall and defocus your eyes, it's in the handout. This will give you an idea of some of where I'm trying to teach my organization to go, where I'm trying to get people to think differently, and some best practices in data science. And the biggest one here is the first one, inviting dissent. If you're really a scientist, you say what you think out loud and let other people call you crazy, because that's the only way to find out. So I'm doing that right now. And if you want to call me crazy, by all means, not now because they're recording this, but please feel free to do so later. Albert Einstein said 2 things. I often use these quotes to close because they inspire me. These are not random quotes I pulled off the internet. These are truly inspirational to me. One of the things he said was that we can't solve a problem with the same mind that created it. That's huge. I get a chill every time I say that. And the other thing he said was we should make things as simple as possible, but no simpler. So there you go. That's all I can give you in the time we have. I hope you enjoyed this. I really enjoyed talking to you. It's an honor. Thank you very much.